Hello, I'm Mishjo, and I am here today to talk about Supernatural, the series. Those of you that know me probably know that I used to enjoy the series a bit. I still enjoy some fan works, but really over the years I think a lot of people have come and gone from the series that is Supernatural. It's a series that really should never have lasted even half as long as it did, but with the WB, every time they get anything, or the CW as it happens, every time they get anything that works for any length of time, they just want to hang on to it. They did the same thing with Charmed, and just about every show that has had more than a couple of seasons, they just cling on to it desperately. The show is fundamentally a simple concept that was endlessly overcomplicated and quickly kind of ruined because it was overcomplicated. It should have just been simple. It should have been kept simple, and it wasn't really any more profound. The changes didn't make it a deeper or more nuanced program. It just made it kind of spread out and shallow instead of focused and shallow, which was exactly what nobody wanted. Eric Kripke was basically a hack. And is still a hack. He's not a good writer. He had a decent idea, but he didn't do it at all well. The things that made really the series work were mainly the compelling fan works and the charisma of a lot of the cast that they got. Even just incidental cast tended to be very charismatic and do a very good job. But because it's relevant right now, the finale was just completely out of character and fanfic level. And I am talking as someone who was on bad fanfiction theatre for many, many years and still does the occasional guest spot on there. And I'm not saying that fanfiction is bad, but what I am saying is that when you have fanfiction, there's no consistency that you can count on between writers. One writer may be every bit as good as anything you could go and buy in a bookstore. But most writers, you cannot go in assuming that, because most of the time it's just someone writing primarily for themselves and their own amusement. And I don't think there's anything wrong in that, but as I will mention later, I do think that there is something wrong with that when you are intending to write something for mass consumption, mass appeal, and an overall scenario where you are marketing it and merchandising it and things like that. But by the last 5 years, if not more, have been fan fiction level, at best. Most of the time, it's just stuff that you would get on Archive of Our Own or something, and you would find these fanfics, and sometimes you'd find a good one, or a decent one. Sometimes you'd find an exceptional one. And it's funny because, especially in fanfiction is one of the things that is still actually appealing about the series, whereas the series itself is rarely appealing and rarely consistent with anything it used to do, which was the stuff it did well, which made people enjoy it and made the show good back in the day. And it's worth noting that Jensen Ackles, who plays Dean, hated the finale of the series, thought it was completely wrong, and hilariously, Kripke thought that it was fine, which just emphasizes what a fucking hack he is and how worthless he is as a writer. If he knew anything about writing, especially commercial writing for a large-scale audience, he would not have that particular opinion, and he certainly wouldn't want it to be out there that he liked that, because it's a bad writing choice. It's a bad writing direction. And when you have that sort of taste as a writer, no one should really want to get you on a series that they are trying to merchandise and promote and spin off and things like that. It does not work that way. But it does make me kind of wonder, though, because previously in the series, Jensen had had some lines altered, reportedly, although it was debated on the accuracy of that. So we'll never know, but it makes sense that after someone has played a character for a long period of time, they might know little things like how a character would speak, what they would and wouldn't say. That doesn't mean that they can generate the narrative around themselves or that they are good as writers on a show, but sometimes they can get lines changed and so forth. But it just makes me wonder, like, if he had lines changed, which I would imagine both he and Jared Padalecki and any of the other, Misha Collins and so forth, any of the other recurring major characters probably would be able to do that. But, like, of the two essential actors for the series, you would think that one of them would be able to say, no, this is a really badly written thing. We shouldn't do this, and I'm not going to do it. You can either change it or not film it. Which they really should never have filmed it, because in the previous episode they tied up all of the stuff that they needed to tie up, except, of course, for rescuing Castiel, which you knew they were going to do, because even if they just sort of obliquely indicate it, it's something that would happen. That's sort of what I'm getting at here, is that it was just another stupid season cliffhanger. That's all it was. The whole thing also leaves so many characters in limbo, figuratively and I would imagine literally too. The running gag of Chuck being God is really wearing thin by now. It wasn't that good to begin with. He was a shitty writer, and it was a really bad episode that was extremely hostile to the fans, which I would guess, even though they're leaning heavily on fan support now, that this is at least consistent with the rest of the entire series, which has generally been rather hostile towards the fans. Like, a lot of the actors are very, very fan positive and fan friendly, but the show, its crew, its personnel, they have never been appreciative of fans, not really. And every point where they could make a little snappy comment or take a shot at fans and the fandom, they would do it. And I'm not saying that all the fandom is great, but I am saying that when your work is inferior to the people that just watch your show, you might want to kind of not bring that up and not force that kind of antipathy, I guess you could say, because these are the people that can do better than you're doing, but for whatever reason, generosity or kindness, charity, as Tolkien might say, they are watching for what you can give them. But getting back to the finale, it makes the entire cosmology of the show meaningless, and it is absolutely wrong with everything that went before. So when you take all this time to make it a completely dysfunctional crapsack universe and a cosmic sort of setup that no longer functions because of actions taken during the series that you're a part of, and have access to all the scripts, all the episodes, there is no excuse for this kind of inconsistency. It's lazy, it's sloppy, and it's shitty. And one of the worst things to do with a finale is exactly what they have done with this. It makes everything seem meaningless, pointless, and a waste of time, which it completely and totally is if you take that at face value. The major problem with it can be seen by looking back at the episode Mystery Spot. During that episode, which is an episode that I often recommend to people as an introduction to the series and the characters specifically, they had an episode that focused very strongly on Sam and Dean's connection, how close that was, and how absolutely inseparable they are as characters. They are essentially one character, because they cannot exist without each other very well. When they are apart for any length of time in the series, it doesn't go well for either of them. In or out of character judging this, one character does not work without the other to play off of. One of the major reasons why we only join Supernatural when Dean is coming back for a reunion with Sam because their father is missing is because Dean and Sam don't work apart. It's like Batman without Robin. It is much more difficult and also much more boring when you have Batman just doing his own thing without anything to act as a bridge between that character and the audience. As much as some of the audience may want to be Batman, they can't really focus on a narrative that doesn't have something between them and Batman. Regardless, the characters have not changed that fundamentally since then, even though sometimes they will conspicuously and sharply change personality, and assumptions that you thought were essential about the character can change sometimes between episodes in the same season. The most crucial parts of them are usually persistent. Usually by looking at the different seasons, you can at least recognize the characters, which is a very important part. But the finale expects us to take something in the window dressing of, oh, remember when this show was good? Remember when we do episodes that are like when the show was good? And they try and start doing that, but they forget that if you're going to do that, you're going to bring up a whole lot of inconsistency, because we remember those parts because they were the good parts, and we remember what the characters were like in those particular episodes because they were particularly good. It simplifies the characters, and that's where they shine the most. They are not effective if they are overcomplicated. So if you look at them in the way they really thrive and the way they were intended, they act completely out of character in the finale. But you know, that's also consistent with most of the series. Most season finales will have them act completely inconsistent with anything they've ever done before, because they want to make it dramatic, and they had to keep trying harder and harder, and in less and less plausible ways to make that happen. Like I said before, it's just another season finale that tries to be dramatic, but would probably be resolved within the first 10 minutes of the next season. I would only believe it as a finale for the series if they'd had the last scene be Dean and Sam full frontal finally banging on screen. Then I would believe, yep, they decided to burn the bridge, decided to just end it, never to be resurrected again. But no, they're inevitably going to bring it back. But this was neither the right time nor the right approach for that kind of finale that they tried to do. Even as a season finale, it is extremely tacky, tasteless, and completely disregards everything that the characters have done and everything they've struggled for over all the years the show has run. As I mentioned before, it's been fan fiction level for many years. Like, even if you take one of my favorite episodes of the later seasons, which I consider basically everything past season 3 as the later seasons, but I guess you could say past season 5, where there was at least some attempt, sort of, at cohesion. One of my favorite episodes was Everybody Hates Hitler. It was an excellent episode, and it dealt with a golem that had been inherited by a guy that didn't know anything about his past, his heritage, or owning a golem, and a cabal of Nazi necromancers known as the Thule. This was a brilliant episode, and for years afterwards, I had mentioned what a shame it was that they didn't make them into recurring villains, because they easily could have made them into nasty, nasty villains, because everybody hates Nazis. It's in the title of the episode. They could have had these assholes be an ongoing villain, an ongoing menace for some time. It could be like Wolfram and Hart with Angel, but they didn't, for whatever reason. I don't know why, I don't understand why they didn't do that. But then, out of nowhere, years later, they finally did a follow-up called The One You've Been Waiting For. They resurrected Hitler in this episode, and it still managed to be one of the worst episodes of any show I've ever seen. It was like someone had accidentally filmed and produced a really bad fanfic that was incredibly lazy, used no end of shorthand that the audience could not be relied upon to know, and basically turns the characters into caricatures. And this isn't like the shallowness that I discussed the show having. This is turning a character into a cartoon, basically, that just has nothing to do with who they actually are. It's mainly fan assumptions and stupid stereotypes that have been created from something that the character did once, or said once, or it was funny once. But when you can take a story where you have Nazi bad guys that resurrect Hitler in an episode and the episode is still bad, you need to look at your writing staff and probably fire them all. They are not doing a good job. If you cannot make Hitler into a compelling villain for an episode, even just one, you do not deserve to be watched at all. Like, you don't deserve to have a job as a writer. So this brings me to my assignment for you, the listener. Write a fanfic to fix the series. I mean, they're probably going to do it anyway when they inevitably bring it back. But yeah, write a fanfic, and if you don't know what happened or haven't seen it, it doesn't matter, because neither did the writers, apparently. But yeah, I'm just going to bet right now that anything any of you write, no matter how short or lengthy, no matter how familiar you are with the series, it will be better than anything that has appeared on Supernatural for like the last 10 years, aside from Scooby-Natural, that one episode. Supernatural was never just an amazing, great classic show, but it worked very well for what it was, at least at the beginning, which was an episodic Monster of the Week series that had hot guys as the lead. It never used the hot guys to the extent that it could have and should have, but that's what they were going with, and that's what they knew could sell. It's the CW, of course you're gonna have hot people, usually pretty young, as the leads. It was kind of amazing that Supernatural went as long as it did, because it seemed like all of the shit on the CW has 20-somethings at the most. So bravo for that at least. But season 1 was the best and most solid, consistent season. And Eric Kripke, the showrunner, clearly only had an idea of what to do for that first season. He floundered around the whole second season, and then the third season was a disaster for many reasons, and part of that was the writer's strike. So it lost about half a dozen episodes, from what I understand, which really might have gone some ways to making the season more cohesive. The only thing that really saved the show for season 4 and beyond was the addition of Castiel. The actor was charismatic, and he brought a lot more to the character than the writers portrayed or even intended. The character had not been intended to return, and they had to write him in a lot of stuff afterwards because he was intended to be just a flash in the pan, not staying around. But largely because Kripke really didn't have an idea of what he was doing and was flying by the seat of his pants, which is very, very obvious despite his claims. It's just this bleak, dysfunctional disaster. It's really terrible, because when you look at it, there's so much that could have been done well, but just wasn't and doesn't work consistently with anything else. You know, I was thinking about, when I was talking about Jensen, you know, maybe refusing to film something that he thought was subpar, which I think is fair, it reminded me of Charmed. And the actresses in Charmed, they pulled a lot of diva moves and got a lot of things changed that the producers or so forth wanted to do with the show. And I don't think the diva behavior was always good, but I think sometimes it helps, because if you know what the fans want and the fans are watching for, and clearly the writers or the crew don't, maybe you should say something. Maybe you should pull a diva move. And it's not like it would have affected Jensen's career. He's been doing the same show for like 15 years, and he's got something lined up for after it. If he didn't want to do the finale because he thought it was shit, they already tied up everything anyway in the episode before. Most people probably are just going to ignore the finale anyway, because it's just another cliffhanger episode, and it's not really even a good one. If they ended up not being able to film one, who cares? He's already secured his next work. He doesn't have to worry about that. Even if it reflects poorly on him, or if the crew decide, oh, you know, that was such a shitty move. Well, you know what? Maybe you should get better writers. I don't disagree with that. But they have no commitment to any storyline over the entire run of the show. None of the storylines get any sort of satisfying, fulfilling, even really a resolution that ties up anything that you would really think would be essential to tie up. They build up foes constantly to be these huge deals, and aside from the yellow-eyed demon, there really was not that much that was impressive that happened in the show, and that was mainly because it was still early on for it to be very impressive for them to be able to do these things. But they kept escalating, and then they would build something up to be the best thing ever, and then it would just be a wet fart resolution, as I've discussed on many, many times before. And the lack of consistent characterization tends to only be acceptable because the actors have great charisma and great chemistry with each other. If they didn't, this show would have been cancelled years ago. The appeal point of Supernatural is the freedom of the road and the beauty of small-town America. It's a romance of the roads, a refuge of the roads sort of scenario, and it works very well when it stays strictly with that. It could have been that every episode forever. You know it and I know it. This show would still be running if it had stuck with the formula in season 1. But as soon as they started to complicate it, and as soon as they started to make them the most important people in the fucking universe, that's when it kind of floundered. Because they had to keep escalating everything, or they felt like it wouldn't be taken seriously. Well, that's kind of your fucking fault when you had the apocalypse happen multiple times and you keep having it happen. The thing about that consistent need to escalate with a lot of these shows and stories and series is that it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work very well. I remember I was talking about why I enjoyed the original series Doctor Who and why I cannot stand the shitty soap opera that's taken its name years after the fact, was because not every fucking story in the original Doctor Who was about saving the goddamn universe. The Doctor was not the most important person in the entire universe. He was just a person, an exceptional person of his kind, but he was just a guy that tried to do his best to help people. And sometimes that was just a simple mystery that had no real repercussions outside of a household. Sometimes that's just what happened. One of my favorite serials of the original run of Doctor Who is Black Orchid, a 2-episode story that is basically a mystery, and it has some drama in it, it has some wonderful, wonderful atmosphere in it, great ambience. But at its root, it is just a mystery story. It doesn't even have aliens in it. There's very little sci-fi in it, other than the fundamentals intrinsic to the series. But it wasn't these gigantic scale of events. They had had that when the previous Doctor, in his last adventure, was trying to stop the force of entropy and the collapse of the universe that was being accelerated by his enemy. But that didn't mean that they constantly had to be at that level all the time. As soon as they started to complicate Supernatural, it got away from them because they weren't good writers. They didn't have a plan either. If you don't have a plan, don't try to half-ass put something together with overarching storylines and these enemies build up to be the best thing ever. Just keep it episodic. You can keep it going forever. People will still watch that stuff forever. If you get the formula right, and you get the window dressing right, they will tune in. I mean, quirky hotels and motels, quaint little backwoods towns, or suburbs even sometimes. But there is a great appeal to this small town living, and seeing, even just for a moment, this seemingly endless series of these little towns is a really romantic thing. It's a really romanticized thing to look at, and it's very charming, even though a lot of the time you're dealing with either horrible people or monsters that treat the people horribly. A lot of these small towns are as messed up as anything in a horror film. But it's a formula that works really well, because people ultimately like seeing those little windows into small town life, regardless of where they live. It can be made to look idyllic, and it can also be kind of not only a sort of a time capsule and a look at a sort of a cross-section and a representation of the larger society and culture, and it can also be at times something removed from the rest of everything, something a little bit behind the times, which I think works really well with Supernatural because ultimately its most important, I guess, most essential theme is also kind of an old-fashioned way to look at the story, kind of an old-fashioned perspective to take a story. But there's really no reason why they couldn't have just stuck with that concept and just kept it going. They would have found it easy. It would have been readily accepted and tuned in, and even if it weren't the ratings monster that it had been in the beginning, they would have been able to easily spin off things, and at the very least wouldn't have driven away all of their fans by the time the show finally farted to an unhappy stop where someone tried to pretend like he was much cleverer than he actually was and write a total piece of shit of an ending that really just reads like any other cliffhanger season finale, and probably will be reduced to that when inevitably they want to make money from a recognizable name because the series ran for over 15 years. Hopefully that time, the next run-through, they will avoid some of the pitfalls that Supernatural had, one of which was the obsession with killing off characters, even going so far as to bring back characters and actors to the show who haven't appeared on it in forever, just to kill them off. Or they ruin them even more than they already had, like the ghost faces in the Slenderman episode that they inexplicably called Tallmen instead. I do not understand this thing where they will jump on a trendy ghost or creepypasta or some character like that, when things like Slenderman, they're very difficult for anyone to claim copyright on because it was such a broad communal sort of creation and it went out in a lot of different directions. But stuff like that, if anything, is in the public domain. Like, I know they wanted to distinguish themselves, but they were also obviously wanting to bank on the recognition of that character. But all this abuse of the characters and lack of respect for the characters, as well as a lack of respect for and at times contempt towards the fans, really fucked them when it came time to attempt spin-offs and merchandise, which they also were really dragging ass in doing. Let me tell you, Supernatural didn't really get very merchandised or very promoted, very marketed in that way, until at least season 8 or 9. And by then, it was struggling to gain and hold onto an audience that had been alienated from it because it had drifted so much from what it was supposed to be. And it didn't really work. You had to know all these stories that had been sort of abortively built up and then just sort of fizzled out. After a point, you just tune in and expect, well, Dean and Sam and probably Castiel are going to get through this, and then all these other characters are going to come and go. Most of them will probably get inexplicably and unsatisfyingly killed off for no real reason. And occasionally they'll do an episode where for one single self-contained episode they will do something that is true to the characters and the whole concept of the goddamn series and actually be good enough to make me think, well, maybe I can watch some other episodes and they'll be just as good, and they never are. But one of the things that you absolutely don't do is you don't end a show for mass consumption in a shitty way. Look at Game of Thrones, look at Voyager, look at all of these shows that have super duper shitty finales or last seasons or even last few years. That is not a good idea, especially if you want to continue to profit from the show, which you will want to do. The CW and Warner Brothers cannot afford not to profit from Supernatural. They have sunk so much money into that series over the years, and they have sunk so much into merchandise and promotion and recognition of that particular property, that particular series. They are not going to let that go. Do an open ending where you can believe that the characters just continue doing this forever. That's how you market it, and that's how you keep it marketed. Don't try to be fucking clever, 'cause you're not. You're not good enough if you think this is a good idea. When you have stakes on an ending, always do an open ending. Don't try to be neat or funny or clever or smart or any of those things. Don't try and be profound. You will end up completely turning off everyone who stayed around to support you for this long, because that's like a huge middle finger to all of them. And time is one thing we can't get back, so they were wasting an unreplenishable resource on your shit that you repaid them with a giant fuck you. And that can really ruin people's affection for a series. It can put them off it, even rewatching old good episodes. And that really is a bad idea, especially considering that they tried to spin off the show several times in the last few years. That really cultivates a resistance from all of the viewers to that exact thing. But it's crucial, since they were trying to do that to keep that property alive and keep it as profitable as possible. If you are doing something for mass consumption and trying to churn out a buck, don't try and be clever or deep with a show that's as shallow as it comes. Do your job, write out pot boilers by the numbers. People aren't going to remember you for writing a few episodes of a mediocre at best TV show. At best, they will remember people like Kripke after someone says, the guy that created Supernatural, and then they'll say, oh yeah, that terrible pretentious writer hack. That guy that did the show that ran it into the ground into something that was barely recognizable as what it was supposed to be. The best episodes are definitely the first season, when he still had ideas and when it wasn't just people desperately trying to think of new adventures for these people. There are some few decent episodes after the first season, a few good ones, but there are fewer and fewer the longer the show runs. The anime actually overall did a pretty great job of presenting the show well, but also having Dean and Sam more consistent and having them make more sense by sometimes helping non-humans, because they actually try and help situations and do the best thing possible, not just going around murdering people that are supernatural. But the anime was also in part so good because it curated most of the best episodes from seasons 1 and 2 and added in some original ones that mostly worked well aside from a couple. Wendigo is still one of the best episodes of the whole run, and it's the second episode of the series. It has good bits with Sam and Dean, it establishes their sort of Monster of the Week premise, it had good guest stars and a great monster. It is absolutely what I would watch if I wanted to see an early kind of rough example of what the show was when it was at its best, and at its most fundamental, closest to what its concept really always was supposed to be. Mystery Spot, as I said before, really conveys the relationship between Sam and Dean perfectly, and even though you might not understand the surrounding story, because it connected back with a couple of other episodes, it is still very good in and of itself, and it's not very difficult to pick up. Once you watch it, you'll be like, okay, I get what's going on, basically. The Benders, another good one. It was showing that humans can be monsters, that it's not just the supernatural that you have to worry about, and I think that was a very good lesson to teach. Provenance was another good one. It's a personal favorite, but it's still pretty good. It's nothing that complicates itself, and like I said before, this is where the show really shines. The brothers developed as people, and really, in the first season's storyline, Provenance was where they were kind of coming into their own. Sam especially was getting slightly away from his past damage and kind of healing a bit. And that was the first time where it really showed that, and I really liked that. And the supporting characters were also really good. Bloody Mary was a lot of fun, played with the urban legend, did a great job. Playthings in season 2 was mostly an excellent look around a great, compelling haunted hotel story, and it was done so well. The surroundings were great, just the photography, the cinematography, all of the sets, just everything was so good in that. Unfortunately, there were some not so great character moments, but it was, yet again, as usual, thanks to the overarching story that didn't really work very well, and of course they didn't really pay off anything with. Croatoan, another fantastic episode. It focused on a small cast and a small area. It was so good, and it had so much of the relationship between Sam and Dean, and really showed how they felt about each other and who they were as people, which I think was very effective. No Exit was a great one. It was another more Monster of the Weeky one, but it had Ellen and Joe, who were great characters, always, and I think they really should have had the Roadhouse be their sort of home base and nexus, because they struggled throughout the entire run of the show to establish one of those and would resist it every single time. But the Roadhouse worked so well. Joe, Ellen, Ash, they had all these characters that worked excellently and gave a great indication of the greater world of these people that hunt the evil supernatural and try and protect humans from all these fantastic creatures. Born Under a Bad Sign was very welcome because we got a look at Meg again and showed Dean and Sam's connection. Sam got to do a little bit more in terms of how he acted, which was great. Hollywood Babylon was fun. It's not a great episode, but it's kind of fun. Bad Day at Black Rock, excellent. It has Bella in it, and she is one of the best characters in the entire run of the series. She should have been kept around. I'm just assuming that the character just continued to survive as she always had, and the actress wisely did not return to the show because they just would have horribly, meaninglessly killed her off for sure this time. Red Sky at Morning was another great one, and this was a great development of Bella, and also developed the brothers really well, especially with Bella. And I think it really worked very well for them to have a kind of a questionable rival character who was more successful and was a woman. I think it was really good as a well-done female character that also brought a huge amount to the show and the story. Bella was actually one of the earlier examples of a completely wasted character and an actor that was way too good that they really should have begged to stay around, who had great chemistry with the main characters. And then, after season 3, there's just a bit here and there. Most of the episodes are just not fully good, or they're pulled down by the terrible episodes around them. They introduced Adam, for example, a half-brother to the Winchesters, and got rid of the character in the same episode in one of the most absolutely, offensively, shittily written pieces of television garbage that has ever aired. They made it worse shortly after, of course, and then they weren't able to get the actor again because he actually got a better career, and they were cheap. But the series is filled with these forgotten storylines that were actually major things if you looked at them through any sort of appraising lens, that they just built up and then threw away and hoped you wouldn't remember. Which reminds me again of Charmed, because they would do things in Charmed for a one-off joke or a silly reference or something that seems cool without quite realizing that they were adding to their own canon and continuity, but they would just conveniently ignore that any time they didn't want to be reminded of it. Yet another thing they failed to resolve in any meaningful way in any of the seasons that they thought would be their last one. And then you have some bits like Yellow Fever, Wishful Thinking, Chris Angel is a douchebag, but those are pretty good aside from the occasional appearance of Ruby, for example, who was fucking awful. Absolutely one of the worst characters in the entire run of the show. They kept her around and got rid of Bella. Fuck. And when we get to season 5, things like The End, for example, interesting, but seriously flawed because of the overarching story. Changing channels, similar. Fun for a minute, but brought down by the absolutely terrible, say it with me, overarching plotline. After that, there's not really a lot of good episodes, aside from a couple. Most are brought down by the half-assed major plot lines around them that are bringing them down. They had some great characters, and some not-so-great characters, but most of them were completely wasted or were complete wastes of time themselves. Everybody Hates Hitler, that I mentioned before, was probably the best episode in years. It dealt with the Golem, it dealt with the Nazi necromancers, but the follow-up, which inexplicably again came years later, was a fanfiction-level disaster that somehow wasted resurrecting Hitler. Scooby Natural was one of the best episodes of the entire series, which didn't surprise me that they marketed it so much, because here was an episode that seemed to remember what the characters were about. Because you had to. Because you had the Scooby-Doo characters who, while being kind of shallow in some of the same ways, are nonetheless very well defined. It got most everything about most of the characters right, showing that they could do it, but just didn't give enough of a fuck to bother most of the time. Couldn't they have had the writer of that episode just do the finale? Or, better yet, be a main writer more of the time? Surely it couldn't be any less deserving to have the finale well written than it was to have the Scooby-Doo crossover well written. It is, in my mind, very telling that this is what we look back on now that the series has finally ended. And it's good it's over because it was just getting worse. Moments like Scooby Natural gave us false hope that they would actually improve the show, make it more consistent, and make it a better experience. But they didn't. What I would like to advise anyone looking at this for a learning experience is recognize the ways that they failed. Recognize what they did wrong. And a lot of that was treating characters as disposable, having contempt for your fans and audience, queerbaiting, and doing a will they or won't they in most cliffhangers, ensuring that if your show doesn't get renewed or decides to end for some reason, you only have an unsatisfying ending. And don't try and be cute and clever, 'cause odds are you're not gonna be. Just because one person enjoys something, a particular story element, something like that, doesn't mean that it's going to have mass appeal. I recognize that better than anyone. If I had a particular, kink that I wanted to entertain in fanfiction, I could do that and not feel particularly bad about that, because ultimately I'm writing it for myself. If you don't like it, don't read it. If it traumatizes you to read something that depicts that kink or whatever, don't read it. Like, if I have a kink for, Gouda and grapes before sex, and every scene of it has them having, this is getting progressively stupider, but it's still probably more clever than most of the last seasons of Supernatural. But if I had that, and you just hated cheese, or you hated grapes, or something like that, I wouldn't feel too bad about it because I was just doing a fanfic, or something like that. But if you're doing it to market it, and you're doing it for an audience, especially a mass audience and mass marketing, you can't do that. It's different if you're writing fanfiction, because fanfiction is generally written for you as a person, for your amusement, for your gratification. It is a bonus if other people like it too. And yeah, it makes you feel good, but at the same time, you cannot rely on that. And that's why I say the last few seasons of Supernatural, in fact, the last 10 years of Supernatural, have been fanfiction level. They have been at the level of someone writing something for themselves that they sort of hope other people will like, but ultimately they don't give a shit because it doesn't matter. They're writing it for their own gratification and no one else's. And that, I think, is the thing that went the most wrong with Supernatural. Fundamentally, the series creator was not particularly creatively gifted or particularly good at his craft, but the charismatic actors and the very appealing concept went a long way to keeping the series going. After he left the show, other people tried to keep it going on because the CW don't like to end anything that they can milk an extra dollar out of. They did it with Charm too. It's unfortunate that a show with such promise wasted that promise almost immediately and ended up a sad relic that had become almost self-parody because the quality that was there once upon a time was nowhere to be seen in a series that turned out to be almost unrecognizable as what it was supposed to be, which is especially unforgivable since it is such a simple concept and a simple premise. But that is, more often than not, what caused Supernatural to decline and end up where it was. By overcomplicating things and constantly escalating, as well as treating characters as disposable and the audience as optional. I look forward to seeing your fanfics that fix the series, because I would be willing to bet that all of the ones that you write will do a better job than anything in the last few seasons of Supernatural. Least of all, the just horrible attempt at closing the series. So, I will see you again next time. Thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing your comments. I'm sure a lot of you have feelings and thoughts about this. You're welcome. Bye.